4 combination therapies currently in the market. All of them have dexamethasone as well. And there's a new one being developed called KPD, which is the one that we're focusing on, and it involves Kyprolis, pomalidomide, and dexamethasone. So next slide. Yeah, so the scope of the project is basically to develop KPD, a new drug development project. And the reason why it's so important is because a lot of people and patients with multiple myeloma are currently resistant to existing therapies, especially like lenalidomide is a very common therapy that people have resistance to. So there's definitely a lot of potential for this drug. And in order for it to be successful, not only does it have to be effective, it also has to pass through a series of clinical trials and FDA approvals. So there's preclinical trials as well as clinical trials with 3 phases. Phase 1 is a smaller scale efficacy safety dosage study. Phase 2 is a bigger study with more participants focusing on safety, dosage, and effectiveness. And the third one is the largest scale study that focuses on efficacy compared to other drugs, as well as like potential adverse side effects. And also the drug has to pass several FDA approvals, including IND, which is the investigational new drug application after preclinicals, and the NDA, which is the new drug application after clinical trials.
So a little bit about our target market, like Liza mentioned, we're focusing on multiple myeloma, which is a type of cancer that's recurring. And so its current size globally is approximated to be 14.3 billion in 2023, with a compounded annual growth rate of 7.5%. And it's projected to reach 33 billion in 2030. So as you can see, it's a significant market size globally. And some of the drivers that have contributed to this forecast and growth are recent advancements in therapeutic options and an increasing prevalence of this disease, as well as improved survival rates with the introduction of these new therapies. And so we sort of looked at the competitors in this market that had treatments for our specific disease, and we saw that the market was dominated by Johnson & Johnson. They have 91% of the market share in the US, and their main treatment is Darzalex, which is also multiple myeloma treatment, and they have patented it till 2035. They also forecast to have 3/4 of all MM patients by 2030 with a 48% year-on-year growth rate. So this makes it really hard for other players to capture market share. And some other players like Bristol Myers Squibb have a small presence, but it's very difficult for new entrants. That being said, as an advantage for KPD is our cycle length and the efficacy of our product.
Okay, so now I'm going to be going over the project schedule. So KPD is currently in phase 1/2, which started on August 6th, 2020, with its estimated completion of this phase to be by October 1st, 2024. So today we see that phases 1 and 2 clinical trials are combined more often. So for phase 1/2 trials, there are 2 main types of designs, one of which being a dose escalation followed by an expansion cohort or joint modeling to identify the best trade-off between the toxicity and the activity. So using the supplemental NDA timelines that AMGEN has previously completed, like for KRD and KD, as well as using the DDD files and other research, we can estimate the drug development timeline for the development of KPD. So some big takeaways that we've noticed were that it takes around 6 to 8 years to complete, with the phases 1 and 2 taking 2 to 3 years, and phase 3 taking 3 to 5 years. So according to our estimated project timeline, phase 3 is predicted to be completed by May 9th, 2028, while the FDA approval is predicted to be completed by December 19th, 2028. However, this drug development timeline is already behind schedule since the expected completion date for phases 1/2 has already passed 2 months ago. Which brings me to the next slide, which is talking about the project risks. in which we have observed a noticeable decline in drug development success rates from 2008 to 2023. So today, the likelihood of approval for a new phase 1 drug is a mere 6.7%, in which the main hurdle has really been advancing past phase 2, in which 28% of programs have successfully advanced past this stage. So one reason why clinical trials may fail is due to their inability to meet enrollment goals and timelines initially set. In fact, 80% of clinical trials are in this position, resulting in costly delays and financial losses, which amount to $8 million in lost revenue per day on average. However, companies with proven expertise in drug development, like AMGEN, are more likely to navigate the clinical drug development processes in order to help avoid risks of failure.
Finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about our costs and eventually get into our evaluation. So first, I wanted to talk about the direct costs and the fully loaded costs. The direct costs are based on just R&D and all the money that you would pay for testing. As you can see, phase 1 and 2 are much cheaper than phase 3 because phase 3 is that mass testing. Also, phase 4, this is just extra testing if the FDA requires it after you try and submit an application. That's not always required, but we decided to include this possibility here. And then fully loaded is just including all of the overhead costs. And this is generally 50% more than what the direct costs are. This graph is from the DD09, so phase 1 and phase 2 numbers are true. Phase 3 for direct costs are incomplete. That was mentioned in the DD09, but we just wanted to include it to kind of talk about that relationship. And in our evaluation, we're going to use for phase 1, 2, 3, and 4 around 50% more than what these direct costs are. And finally, this is our decision tree. Obviously, it's very zoomed out, but I'm just going to talk about like the big picture. So this is a tree we go through first preclinical, then phase 1, 2, 3. We go through the NDA application. We see if we need phase 4. We have the marketing and distribution costs, and then we have great, good, and bad outcomes. The way that we decided these outcomes and these revenue streams is we looked over the next 12 years how much of the market we're going to get. I believe for great outcome, we looked at 20% of the market, good outcome 8% of the market, and bad outcome 3% of the market. And we found that our final NPV of this project is $646 million, which obviously is positive and means that the project is viable. But we also thought that this very high outcome was pushed by these extremely high revenues, which, as you can see, the great outcome is like 60 billion, something like that, which is very, very low probability, but it's still pushing that NPV higher. So we decided to look at risk-adjusted NPV, which uses utility theory, which was taught in CIV 205. It basically just scales all of the consequences by a logarithmic function and makes it so those really high revenues aren't as powerful, pushing the NPV up. We found that utility value was actually negative, which means that if you were a risk-averse company, you wouldn't want to go with this project because you'd be ending up spending a lot of costs for a very small chance of revenue. However, we decided to go against this and use our normal NPV and say that AMGEN should proceed with this recommendation just because drug development processes are in general really risky, and we felt like these R&D research projects, you shouldn't really look at them through a typical risk-averse project analysis.
Okay, thank you. Nice job. So a couple of questions. The risk adjusted, is that what's the probability? Are we talking about an 80% likelihood, or did you do the Monte Carlo analysis?
No, for risk adjusted, all I did was we just scaled the consequences. So
it's expected monetary value times.
Yeah.
Okay, so
yeah,
that's
it was just a logarithmic function.
Because normally anything negative in a risk adjusted NPV would be considered like a no-go.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, that's why with this risk adjusted, we found that like if you adjust for how unlikely those really high revenue streams are,
Okay.
It doesn't make sense to go with this project. But just because all these R&D research, all these R&D projects are so risky, we felt like we should just use the normal NPV.
Also, like contextually, AMGEN has a lot of experience in Kyprolis combination therapies, and since pomalidomide, the other drug that it's being used in, has already been studied,
Mhm.
like effectively, that's kind of played into our decision.
Got it. $8 million per day. Is that just lost revenue or are those costs associated with carrying the project? Or is it both?
Andrew, did you?
I cannot recall off the top of my mind, but I think it'd at least be costs, and then maybe it would involve the lost revenue, but my guess would just be.
Yeah, I think it was just the cost that we accounted for.
Yeah, so you want to look at both generally, and this would be also known as the cost of slippage. I think we covered the idea, at least in class, that the cost of slippage is quantifying what the value of time is to your project. And the reason project managers care about that is you're going to use that as a rallying cry to say, look, if I can save a day on this project, that's $8 million, to the company. So that doesn't mean they're necessarily going to write you an $8 million check to save a day, but they might certainly you might get their attention by saying, oh, spending a little bit of money on a third party, bringing an additional resource to deal with the bottleneck, outsourcing something that otherwise would take too long internally. These are all ways to justify it by pointing to that $8 million. So think of it as opportunity costs, right? Dollars that could come in the door that you're going to be losing, probably to your competitor is my guess, because sick people need treatment. They're going to get it one way or the other, right? Yeah, otherwise, I think you did a good job. I would have thrown in a Monte Carlo simulation to understand what is the likelihood of actually hitting those dates, because the $8 million per day really gets people's attention, right? To hit those dates, is that 80% confidence, 90% confidence? I'm not sure with the data that you showed, you can state that yet, right? So think about that. Any comments from the audience? Any inputs? These are complicated projects. They have a lot of risk associated with them. Understanding the regulatory frameworks, which you can't do in 10 weeks, and understand the math and understand project management. But there are programs like MSL at the law school where you can learn the regulatory background behind FDA, NHTSA, all the other governing agencies that are out there, and how they operate and how their rulemaking works, so that you can be better. You can be a better engineer, you can be a better engineering manager, right? So keep that in mind. A lot of people say, got to get my MBA. Well, yeah, there's like 10 million people doing that. Try the path less traveled, right? Which is something like an MSL, where you can take your engineering background and then understand the inner workings of the policies and the rules behind the FDA, so that you can become a resident expert and answer the questions about, what if, right? Otherwise, thank you. Nice job. Okay, that was Kyprolis. Let's move on to Nplate. Sure. There's a password, really?
They say you can't get in.
How come only one person needs a password? That seems a little bit odd, but.
We thought it was maybe that he wasn't logged into Northwestern.
Yeah, tell him to log in by Northwestern. That would,
He said he is.
okay.
I don't know.
Well, hold on a second. Let me, okay, passcode 677125. If that ain't it, I don't know what is, so.
I plug in share my screen.
You can just share your screen.
Okay.
That should work. It avoids all the wiring. hassle.
Yeah.
I think somebody just joined.
You did. Okay, cool.
And it's pronounced AMGEN, by the way. And by the way, they have a pretty big presence in Deerfield, so check them out. They often hire. Great company.
Should I do my audio or your audio?
I would turn your audio off,
Okay.
otherwise we'll get an echo.
Cool. Okay, so we're gonna be talking about Nplate, which is developed and discovered by AMGEN. So just an introduction on the disease and on Nplate itself. So immune thrombocytopenia is a blood disorder that's characterized by low platelets in the blood vessel. So the way it works is that you can see on the left here, when a blood vessel gets injured, like in a wound, for example, it sends a message to these platelets, and these platelets travel and they try to clot. They stick together and they try to clot this this wound area. And with immune thrombocytopenia, for some reason that is currently unknown, the immune system destroys those blood platelets. So this can lead to excessive bleeding, bruising within the skin and also outside of the skin. So what Amgen found, they discovered ramaplostin, was a thrombopoietin receptor, which connects to the active receptors, and it produces more platelets. So for the sake of this project, currently AMGEN, they had Nplate approved for chronic immune thrombocytopenia in 2008, and they're currently in a phase 3 clinical trial to develop thrombocytopenia specifically for chemotherapy induced patients. The way that works is that chemotherapy destroys the bone marrow where the platelets are produced. So that leads to a reduction of production. Good.
Yeah, so the first thing we did was looking at the total market for this, and it's actually quite common amongst adults. So the market is estimated about like 3 to 3.4 billion. And it grows annually pretty slowly at about 1% depending on the estimates. But Nplate has been like growing significantly, especially since COVID. The US government actually bought a bunch of the Nplate drug since COVID for whatever reason. And so they've been growing at about like 15% year over year. And they're the biggest player in the market, but there are few different competitors which are pretty significant. The biggest one is Promacta, which is developed by the pharma company Novartis, which was given approval in the same year as Nplate. So yeah, that's like the biggest competitor that we'll also see later on for the discovery of the new drug, basically.
Just to go over some of the clinical trials that Nplate has been through. They went through phase 1 and 2 trials, and then phase 3 trials. For phase 1 and 2 was, again, a smaller group of 12 patients, just to test the safety and efficacy of the drug. They took patients with that had their spleen removed, and that still had persistent thrombocytopenia after that. 7 of those 2 patients achieved higher blood platelet counts, and the normal target range is 150 to 450 per cubic millimeter. And then for phase 3, which led to the approval of Nplate in 2008, they did 2 identical designs. Those who had had their spleens removed and those who hadn't. And some key details was that they were randomized to receive either a placebo or ramaplostin for 24 weeks. And then currently, they just began recruiting in 2020 for a phase 3 trial for specifically chemotherapy-induced thrombocytopenia, which we expect or is expected to be completed in 2028.
So to see the future timeline of Nplate through 2022, when we're expected to generate revenue, we look at the timeline analysis of an average of 6.1 years for the phase 3 trials, and that's the paired analysis on the other side.
Yeah. So yeah, you can see there's a perimeter analysis and then the paired analysis that we did. And so we found it to be around 6 years, but we'll talk a little bit later about why it's going to take a little bit longer.
Yeah, and to see visually what the timeline would look like, we made a Gantt chart that gives a structured overview of from phase 3 trials going through FDA approval as well as manufacturing scale up and finally product launch and marketing. And we see that the first eight years would be for phase 3, And then we estimated a 22-month cycle for the FDA approval. And then manufacturing, scale up, and marketing should take about 4 years in total. And we are expected to generate revenue in 2032 if everything goes deterministically, which it might not, which is why we ran a Monte Carlo simulation. The distribution that we used was a beta distribution just because we felt that it's more likely that a trial would get procrastinated and may take longer than it actually being completed earlier than expected. Therefore, our distribution kind of looks like a heavy tail off at the end. And the optimistic duration that we chose was a 90% of the mean, and the pessimistic was 125% of the mean.
Yep.
So for the results of the Monte Carlo, we see that the optimistic completion date is early 2032, and the pessimistic is late 2035. But as you can see that it's likely going to be around July 2032. And the key insights are that it's a heavy tail distribution because of the reasons I just said, and the potential to complete earlier is much earlier is less likely than it being late.
Sorry. So just to go over some risks that we discovered first, FDA approval. Getting through FDA approval requires a lot from just through a process perspective. There's an analysis of the target condition and available treatments. There's an assessment of benefits and risks coming from clinical data. And a lot of the times, this data could be imperfect or not complete. So this is a big barrier that drugs can't get past. And then also there has to be an analysis and an evaluation of strategies for managing risks. We also thought of manufacturing risks and ethical and public perception. Manufacturing just simply is that since it is a complex manufacturing process, there are a lot of steps that adding could deter the development, and then scaling up could add capital or required capital. And then ethical and public perception, we thought that since Nplate is a really expensive drug, there could be concerns around kind of the access and the cost surrounding that. There could be safety concerns. And then one thing I wanted to highlight at the end is that there also could be environmental concerns, since hematology especially is very heavy in clinical trials, and that negatively affects the environment. It creates a lot of waste.
To estimate the cost analysis of the drug development, we first looked at the R&D cost that Amgen spends on all of their drugs, which is about 4.8 billion, but the late stage clinical trials make up the largest portion, which is about 40% of that R&D cost, to about 1.9 billion. And the Nplate development, which is in phase 3 currently, would fall under the late stage clinical programs. We look, but Amgen does not divide the R&D cost based on products. But it does say the sales revenue for each product, and therefore we sort of looked at what the Nplate sales contribution to all of Amgen, which is about 5%, and we could roughly estimate that the R&D cost would be 5% of the 4.8 billion, which is about 240 million per year. But we are obviously not very confident in that number, and therefore
Sorry.
So therefore, we looked at the DD09 cost estimations as well, which tells us that the phase 3 cost of the mean phase 3 cost is 63 million, and the median is about 74. So we knew that we were off with the sales percentage method of getting the cost estimate, and therefore we thought that this is a much more accurate estimation of what the cost should look like. Therefore, so the phase 3 cost was 63 million in the DD09, but that was for 2009 dollars. So the inflation we saw was 2.45% for the last 15 years, and we adjusted the 63 million for that the factor of 1.438, which gets us our phase 3 cost at 100 million and the phase 4 cost at about 43 million, which is around the same order of magnitude of the sales. So we are confident in that result.
Yeah, so after we determine the different costs, similarly, it's kind of difficult to estimate the total revenue that they're going to get, especially since it's like a new drug and nothing's on the market yet. But basically, the idea was that we know how many cancer patients there are in the world, and then from there we can determine the number of cancer patients that undergo chemotherapy, and then from there the number of patients that develop ITP, and then from there how many people will be buying our drugs. And we estimated the cost of the drug to be anywhere from 20,000 to 80,000, which is kind of similar to what Nplate currently is. And so using all those assumptions, which vary a good amount, we found that the total revenue in year one would be anywhere from 0.8 billion to 4.8 billion. So somewhere in that range.
Seeing the previously discussed assumptions, here's generally what our decision tree looked like going through phase 3. About a 0.73 chance of success there. Then FDA approval. Once we're there, we just used a 1 for our probability of going from phase 4 to market entry, as that's like post FDA approval, like a post FDA approval process. And then from there, market entry, we said there's about an 80% chance. It's about base. Given all the time and energy that goes into market research at a place like AMGEN, with about a 10% chance that it either goes optimistically or pessimistically based on our assumptions. So here's generally what our decision tree looked like. We broke this out a lot more within our NPV. Here you can see the assumptions that we made. Some of these are within the decision tree. We used a 10% discount rate to understand what we might be foregoing by doing this project rather than something else. So here are all of our assumptions up here for revenue. As Giannis discussed, it's tough to tell exactly. So what we did is we started, given that the drug had been growing at about 15% revenue, we said that this is probably too high to continue in the future. So we started here at 2,800, which is between our 0.8 and 4.8 billion estimate. And then we scaled down growth in the first 10 years. And in the next 10 years, we kept it constant. This was kind of our assumption, which led us to like a $50 billion base assumption for potential revenue. Next slide. We went in further. You can see the time to complete, and then you can see much more broken down what each option would look like if we pass a step, if we fail a step, what the probabilities look like on the left. And then we can see ultimately our output here with the summary. We saw that obviously as the steps continue, the expected value continues to get higher. As it takes longer and longer, the NPV will also need to adjust. So here is our output, seeing a 13.92% IRR, higher than our discount rate, which was initially a good sign. You can also see in like a graphical form our summary on the next slide, which shows our expected value over time, with obviously FDA approval being a big spike in the amount that it's worth, along with the NPV.
Yeah, so because our risk-adjusted NPV is so high, the obvious recommendation is to move forward with the project. The IRR is 13.92%, which is higher than the 10% discount rate of the industry standard. Therefore, we definitely want to continue with this project. As mentioned earlier, the strategic marketing opportunity addresses an unmet need, and which is why our expected revenue is so high, and also because and that's also why it ranges from such a high from 0.8 billion to all the way to 4.8 billion. And so yeah, in general, we recommend that we move forward with this project.
Okay, nice job. Thank you. So what I liked about your presentation was the flow, right? You start with schedule, you went to cost, you went to revenue, you looked at risks, you integrated the whole thing. It all flowed, it all made sense. The numbers that don't make sense, to be honest with you, is the revenue side, because it just seems to me like understanding this funnel of, okay, how many people are diagnosed with cancer? And then how many are in the US? Because this is the US regulatory body that's approving it. So you can't really market outside the US for this analysis, right? So how many are in the US? And then from there, okay, how many actually seek treatment? But first, how many can afford the treatment, right? When meaning that they have insurance of some form or another. Young people who are not on Medicare, who are not on Medicaid, they fall into this really, and if they're not working full-time, that has an employer that has medical insurance, they could fall into this kind of gap where, I don't know, something like 10 or 20% of the American public fall into, right? So how many can afford the treatment? How many will seek the treatment? Even if they know they're sick, even if they can afford it, some people just, for religious reasons or other reasons, just say, I'm not going to bother seeking treatment, right? And then what's interesting here is you have a disease within a disease, right? So not everybody who has cancer gets this disease. Am I right?
Right.
So
That was
there's-
one of
that's
the
another
assumptions. I
factor,
think
right?
that was one of the
So there you
assumptions.
go. So that's another part of the
Yeah,
reduction of the
10%
fund, right?
of cancer.
I'm
patients.
just so surprised at the huge NPV. It just seems like it's really big. So either this is a very lucrative drug, and obviously it should be on the top of their priority list, or maybe the revenues seem a little bit off. If you can look at 10Ks from the company, that would give you validation on previous development costs for drugs that are similar, as well as potentially more, better estimates on the revenue potential. Or did you guys already do that?
Yeah, that was, the cost that we saw was from 10K, but
Okay.
they did not list out.
They
what-
didn't talk about the revenue?
They talked about the revenue, but just for the cost that they do not list out what drug specifically required what amount of cost. And this is what they did for the revenue, the sales percentage.
Okay.
Yeah,
And this is also like in 2023, and we are expected to generate revenue in 2032, which obviously.
I guess that's gonna be my last point. When was this patent filed? When does the clock start on the patent? This is where the law and engineering intersect, right, and financial analysis. So let's just assume 2020, patent was filed. You got 20 years from 2020, right? So that takes you to 2040, right? And I don't know when this thing gets approved.
The timeline says about 2030.
2030. So from 2030 to 2040 is the viable marketing window that you can actually sell this product before it becomes generic, before the patent expires, right? So that becomes another narrowing of sorts. So you ask yourself, why are drugs so expensive? I think I've just outlined why drugs are so expensive, right? The window is not 20 years, right? It's far less, sometimes 10, sometimes 7, sometimes 12. The people who can afford to pay progressively get smaller and smaller, depending, especially as it becomes a very expensive drug. Do you know what the price tag is on this drug? Price per dose,
I think your niece looked into
or
that.
maybe it's price per month or something.
Yeah, I think it's about 10,000 a month, if I remember correctly.
Right.
Yeah, it's really expensive.
Yeah, 2 months and you've got a car, right?
Yeah.
A year and you've got a house. So think about that, right? Who can afford that? Especially young people can't afford it. So again, willingness to pay or ability to pay, willingness to get treatment, right? And yeah, politically, that's not going to go over too well, especially if some, journalist type wants to take this to the press and say, hey, $10,000 a month for people who are dying. What's wrong with this, right? But this is typical. This is very typical, especially when you consider how long do people get the treatment for? Is it a week, a month, a year?
I think it's a long time.
Yeah.
Is it
'Cause
lifetime?
Right now, they're treating it for chronic ITP.
So
So
this would be-
it's for patients who have had it over a year and they take it.
And they take the
They
drug
take it
for
once
a
a
year
week.
or more, right?
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
but do they take it the rest of their lives?
From until it's cured, but it's I think it's just to treat it's not for curing, it's just for
It's like
treating.
for
It
treatment.
gets you
Yeah.
to a baseline.
Yeah.
So you have to take it the
platelet
rest
counts
of your life. It's
Yeah.
kind of like insulin in a
Exactly.
sense, right? So, okay, so it's $10,000 a month
for the rest of
for
your
the
life.
rest of your life.
Yeah.
It's not just for a few months, right? Wow. I'm sorry. 120 grand a year, right? Young people could last 40, 50 years. Are we serious? We're talking, a large percentage of them, $1 million, right? Just for this one treatment. You still have to treat the cancer that's
Yeah.
underlying it, right?
Yep.
And this is even after the cancer has been quote unquote rescinded or cured or whatever word you want to use, right?
Yeah.
You still have to do this.
Yeah.
Because you're compromised, your system is compromised. 2024, all right. Any questions? The methodology is the methodology. You guys were very thorough and I appreciate that. So let's give this team a round of applause. You gotta wonder sometimes, there's gotta be a better way, but this is the capitalist approach. So with that, let's go to Lumakras, team 3 and last team for today.
Right, unshare. Oh, stop share.
Somebody left their clothing and a phone. I don't know if that was either of you guys. All right, take it away.
So our drug is AMGEN Lumakras. So Lumakras is a cancer drug that was created by AMGEN, and it targets the KRAS G12C mutation in cancers. It is currently only applicable to non-small cell lung cancer and to colorectal cancer, but they're also looking into applying it to other sorts of tumors. Just a little bit about how the drug works. Basically, the drug targets the KRAS mutated proteins, and it binds to them irreversibly, and basically shuts down the proteins so that the tumor cell can't replicate. Just a little more about the the KRAS12 mutation has long been seen as undruggable because it is extremely smooth and doesn't have a lot of binding spots or a lot of like clear binding spots to latch onto. And because of that, the FDA actually gave this drug breakthrough therapy designation. So it goes through the process a lot more quickly than a standard drug, as we can see here. So the full process took 3 years from like when the phase 2 results were released to when the FDA fully approved it. But the drug actually went on to market in May 28th, 2021 because of this accelerated approval. So basically the way this worked was it posted its phase 2 results, and then it was granted therapy designation, and within 6 months, the FDA allowed it to go to market, and then it finished all of its regulatory steps and it, like finished giving it full full FDA approval. We also see that here, like these are the efficacy results of the Lumakras drug in these types of cancers. This was a phase 3 result, and this was a phase 2. And overall, we see here that the efficacy results are good, not great. So because of that, they're trying to combine it with other sorts of treatment options to improve efficacy results. Just a little bit more about the market size. So if we look at the US market, these are the number of cases that we currently see for non-small cell lung cancer and for colorectal cancer. And within the number of cases that we see, only a certain amount have the KRAS G12C mutation. For non-small cell lung cancer, it's 13%, and for colorectal cancer, it's 3%. So we see that the market size patients column actually has what in theory should be the number of patients that we have, but we also have to take into account that the Lumakras drug is a secondary type of treatment. So they only would recommend this treatment if you previously tried something else and that didn't work. So because of that, our market size of patients actually decreases even more. For non-small cell lung cancer, it's about 70% or go on to a secondary source of treatment. And for colorectal cancer, it's about 50 to 60%.
Oh, this is one of the best funnel slides I think I've seen so far. So you guys either got it or were really fast at typing. I don't know.
But this pathway is very new, but there's a lot of competition in the market coming out soon. So there's Krazati from Bristol Myers Squibb, about the same price, targets the exact same previously thought to be undruggable protein, which is now no longer. They target the same lung cancer and colorectal cancer. But then there's one even further down the pipeline in phase 1. RMC 6236. It targets all sorts of mutations. There are a bunch of different ones, right? This is just C, but they do all the other G12 mutations. And they also target non-small lung cancer, but also they're looking into pancreatic adrenocarcinoma. And of course, chemotherapy radiation can. If these work, they're not going to use them for us. So that's important to understand how that fits in. So the drug is already approved, but they're looking at more tumors. So will be label expansion. So it's a very expensive drug. So any larger market would be fantastic. We know it works based on the trials of the other ones. So now we have to take that phase 2 and 3 to see if it works with pancreatic ductal adrenocarcinoma, which is, if you look at the other slide, has the biggest addressable market of the other tumors with the same mutation. So that's why that would be the next best tumor to target. And as we'll see in two more slides, it has a positive NPV. So it's definitely worth a look.
So if Amgen were to take on this label expansion project specifically for the pancreatic cancer, we drew up a Gantt chart to see what that would look like. We have the luxury of having gone through this process for the 2 other cancer types and having done so very recently. We use that as a template for about how long we think that it would take for our drug to then go through those same processes, rather than just looking at the entire pool of drugs everywhere. So we made the assumption that since, according to the AMGEN pipeline, we're currently in phase 2 trials for what they just call other tumors, that this is probably one of the other tumors that they're exploring. So we finish out phase 2. At the end of phase 2, because the other 2 cancer types received breakthrough therapy designation and therefore got on that accelerated approval timeline, that this other cancer would also receive that. So we're able to go to market after phase 2, if phase 2 is successful. And then while we're doing that, phase 3 can continue and eventually, hopefully get full FDA approval at the end. So all in, we estimate that from now until our go-to-market is about 2.5 more years. But from now until full FDA approval would look something more like 4 to 5, which is pretty similar to what we saw with the other cancer types.
It's important to understand how breakthrough strategies, how wide breakthrough would be important. This particular pancreatic cancer has like a mortality rate of 98%. So that's why this is like so important and so lucrative for this group.
So that takes us to our next slide, which talks about our risk-adjusted NPV. Similar to the previous group, we have a very high risk-adjusted NPV, but we're still confident in this number for 2 reasons. One, our NPV comes through very high because a lot of our costs are in the past. So the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials for the first 2 types of cancers that make up the majority of our market have already occurred. So we're no longer having to allocate massive amounts of money to those projects. So we're only looking at the revenues for that going forward. The second reason is that this is actually fairly consistent with some industry estimates who have looked and said that they estimate that Lumakras is going to be worth about $1.5 billion per year to Amgen by 2026. But if we look at our decision tree, which we link down here, it's too complicated to show on one slide, but I'll highlight a couple of key decision points. One, the success of that phase 1 competitor that we mentioned earlier is worth about $4 billion to us based on our estimates of market sizing and competition. So if it succeeds, our NPV goes down by about 4 billion. So obviously for us as a company, we would hope that it doesn't succeed, which is maybe a little bit sketchy ethically, but we'll let that slide. Next is the pursuit of this pancreatic cancer or not. Again, based on the NPV analysis, we believe that we should do it. But the NPV advantage isn't massive, so it's possible that Amgen could pursue other drugs or use those resources on other drugs rather than doing it. Based on that decision, the success or failure, and then lastly, market conditions, whether we think that they're strong, if they're somewhere in the middle, or very. The last thing that we want to mention is that based on the market size calculations that we talked about earlier, We then made affordability assumptions. We made assumptions about who would actually end up receiving treatment. And then we looked at what we believe our best case market shares could genuinely be. There's not a lot of hard data out there about exactly how much of the market we could potentially target, because we're kind of in new waters here with this drug. But all of that arrived back at an NPV risk adjusted of about $16.8 billion. And if you want to take a look at the decision tree, I'm happy to pull that up on the side.
We can look at that later, but I think, is that it?
Yep,
All
that's
right.
all.
Nice job. So you've got early access to the market. How did that impact your NPV?
So one, it guarantees essentially that if you have successful phase 2 trials and that you get this accelerated approval, that you're kind of going to have 2 years in the market, even if you don't get approval for
So that
your
pumps up
by
your
your phase 3 trial.
NPV compared to.
So
everything
it's going to pump up the NPV. Again, if we go back to the earlier slides, the pancreatic cancer is a much smaller market than the others. So relative to the amount of revenue that we would generate off of non-small cell lung cancer and pancreatic and colorectal cancer, it's relatively insignificant. We're looking at maybe $1 billion in one case, and then 600 million
Right.
in the case that the other competitor that's targeting that gets approved.
Right.
But that's a lot of money.
But that's a significant amount of money that
Yeah.
we think is worth the pursuit.
Okay. I can see where you're almost now bordering on game theory, where you have to start thinking about what your competitors are gonna do, and then what you're gonna do in response to your competitors, and what you're gonna do if you fail versus what if you succeed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's almost like the decision tree. I can see where it gets complicated because it's a function of what others might do, right, in this situation.
They even could be an acquisition target if you want to build
Right.
them.
Right.
Is the other main issue that we face and why we spent so much time focusing on the competitive landscape is because Krazati is pretty much the exact same thing as our drug. They can also target any new cancer market that we would like to target. So there's a lot in the air that just depends on competitors. It's not even as much about our success, it's about their success
Competitors,
as
yeah.
well.
Because if they succeed wildly, which might be great for the patients, may not be so great for
It's
you
not great.
guys.
Yeah.
All right, I think you guys did a great job. Hopefully this was a useful exercise. What do you guys all think? Did you learn something from it? Right, so when people ask, can you be a project manager and not understand the domain? I just kind of laugh and say, well, you can't be an effective project manager without understanding the process, FDA, the context, who your competitors are, something about the business side in terms of, what you're gonna sell, who you're gonna sell it to, who's the market, what's your price point, as well as the risks that are associated with any kind of project of this nature. So you can see where, it might take years to become really a proficient project manager in this environment, maybe upwards of 5 to 10 years, to literally be able to say, give me a new drug discovery, I can take it from cradle to grave, right? Because frankly, it takes 10 years. It's going to be very difficult to have that kind of experience unless you're working on multiple drugs in different phases of their development. So again, a great industry. There's a lot of great companies that surround us here. Consulting firms do a lot of work in this space as well. So it's not limited to the AMGENs of the world. It's the Deloittes of the world and the Accentures of the world that are working with AMGEN to say, let us do the analysis for you. Let us work out the game theory in terms of what might happen if your competitors step into this space, or if they succeed and you don't, right? Otherwise, hopefully you got something out of the class. This is our last session. If you have any comments, send them to me. Otherwise, have a great break. I guess I feel like we're ending early, but this isn't too early to end a class, right?
There is no class on Wednesday, right? Since we're done with
Yeah,
presentations.
we're done with this. We're done with the session. So just make sure your homework's submitted, and we'll take it from there. And good luck with the rest of your careers. Check in with me as you progress them.
I have a quick question for you.
Yeah.
So you see a lot of presentations in your classes.
Yeah.
What do you think are some of the primary keys that make like
A good
a
presentation?
good presentation versus
I think
Right,
ownership, do you
presentation.
feel confident with what you're presenting? Can you answer questions? Are you able to get to the level of depth that was expected?
So like on the depth thing, there's some things that are just like the MPV.
Yeah.
thing. We think it's too complicated to
Right.
discuss. Other teams tried to put it on there, like demonstrate it. We thought
right.
it was too complicated.
I think if you can at least explain it without necessarily, the graphics can be, distracting sometimes, right? It's just like, you're trying to summarize that which is de-summarized in front of your eyes, right? So it can actually lead to a little bit of confusion on the audience's part to say, what I'm reading and what you're saying don't necessarily line up. So sometimes it's easier. In fact, when I was at Motorola towards the end, they were literally saying, turn off the PowerPoint, shut down the computers, just tell me what you got to tell me, right? Just tell me in words about what's going on in your project. So your ability to do that, your ability to explain and to answer questions and to deal with complexity in a summarized fashion that doesn't compromise the complexity, right? That doesn't dumb it down or perhaps strip out meaningful nuance, right? I think that's what makes a good presentation.
So like, what would, if you were presenting that, what would you have changed?
I'm not sure I would have changed too much, except, give a glimpse maybe of what the decision tree looked like, or give it maybe a high level summary or discuss what you modeled in the decision tree, which actually none of the teams actually did, right? Even when they showed the decision tree, they didn't say, well, one team I think did talk about the various approvals. And those are obvious points where you can either succeed or fail, right? But when it comes to competition, how do you layer that in, right? At some point, your competition might suddenly succeed and that diminishes your market share, right? Or it might take away the approvals from the government, or I don't know what it might happen, right? So being able to walk people through that, take care. That's what I would change. But frankly, I think you guys did a great job. I mean, the more you do it, the more comfortable you get. And I think being comfortable. So you're asking me as an audience member, as somebody who sees a lot of these, but the answer is really lying within you, right? How comfortable were you with what you presented? And if you're 100% comfortable, I think that would be odd, because most people will say, I wish I had done this better. I wish I had done that better. And no matter how many times you do it, you're probably going to refine it over time and get more comfortable with yourself. So for me, as an undergrad, I would have never been able to do what you guys did. I hated making presentations. I would sit in the back of class, I would take notes, and I would just do my best on the exams. And back then, engineering school did not require presentations. It required regurgitations of formulas and data and information and basically cranking through problem sets, right? So in that sense, you guys are leap years ahead. But for me, I had to go through a process of training myself to be comfortable in public speaking, right? Getting in front of others, right? And I sense that you guys were more or less there. Maybe not so much, maybe not you a little bit, or?
No, I mean, I was comfortable with the information, but
Okay.
I'm not very good at
Speaking, okay,
Yeah.
so repetition, just try, do it over and over and over, even in a different context. I would go to church and be a lector in front of hundreds of people, right? It's just like, why would I torture myself like that? It's because I knew that in my career, if I didn't, right, my career would ultimately go nowhere, right? So every Sunday I'd be in front of 200 people reading stuff that frankly doesn't always make sense, right? Or it's almost a foreign language. The Bible is a foreign language to many people, right? So being comfortable with yourself, getting that centeredness that comes from doing it so many times that you're never really going to be hopefully uncomfortable again, right? But I thought you guys did a great job, so don't torture yourselves. And recognize it's all learning. I mean, even the things you wish you had done different today, if I gave you another chance, you would change them and do them differently the next time. So, right. And I'll take a look in detail as to what you presented, and I'll give you some, feedback on your report. But otherwise, what did you think? Was it useful to you? Right. Yeah.
I mean, the project itself is an exercise in project management.
Yeah, exactly.
I
I could literally
it's
turn the whole thing
difficult to
inside out and say, just present on what you learned about project management in doing this project. The hell with the results of the project. What did you learn about yourselves, about managing projects and teams, right? I could have done that.
It's like you're kind of starting from scratch of like no knowledge about any of the stuff that goes into it. And so it's like the learning curve is just very steep. And so once you get to a certain point, things start to move quickly, but until then it's just.
Well, and you're climbing multiple learning curves, the process curve of how project management is supposed to work, right? The curve about the context and understanding, you know, something about FDA and something about the drugs and something, you know, so you had all these multiple learning curves, but it was a team of people doing it together. So in that sense, you were all kind of in the same boat, right? You should be proud. I mean, you guys did a great job. So especially since none of you had any real exposure to this stuff before, right?
Bio 150, we learned about all the different.
Well, that came in handy, right?
Learned is a strong term.
I think good on the quiz.
Just like a bioengineer might say, yeah, I took statistics, but I didn't learn a damn thing, right? You guys have the opposite. You're experts in statistics, you know very little about biology. This is where you can add value. This is where companies like, you know, the AMGENs of the world would say, we're impressed. We need your kind of skill set, right? Not just to manage the projects, but to do the analysis all along the way, whether it's decision trees or Monte Carlo or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Game theory. Right?
Right.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey,
Have a
Professor.
good break.
Hey, Professor.
Yes.
For the Boeing deep dive extra credit, I was sort of
Yes.
confused on this assignment. So like I see in the case study, like the chat GBT summary, that there's 5 discussion questions at the bottom. Do you want us to complete those 5 and then submit our answers to those?
What did I put in the actual assignment? I thought that was it, right?
So you say that there's a lot of issues or drivers that
Yeah.
can be used to explain the current state of Boeing, and then
Yeah, you can use those 5 questions as a guide to answering that question.
okay.
Yes, that makes sense. Yep.
Okay, yeah. I answered those 5 questions and I sort of like integrated some of the drivers or issues that you put. So would that be fine?
Okay. That sounds good. That sounds
Right.
great. What do you think of all that? Was that a good assignment?
Yeah, I mean it was just more of like elaboration on the actual case study that we read, and like
Yep.
doing a little bit more research on the actual drivers. So
And
like
some of the issues that have happened since then, because the case study was 767, right?
right.
And this is more 737 Max, right?
Yes.
So, but it's the same problems, just different platforms.
Yeah, so it was a lot more like researching current Boeing environment, that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Because I only like tackled like relationship with union, so I looked at like the union news or like the focus on production versus quality and safety. So
Yep.
and then I sort of tackled like the 5 questions that you put on there. So I think
You know,
I should
there's
be
some
fine.
some whistleblowers have disappeared, right?
Yes.
I mean, they're no longer with us type thing, right?
Yeah. It's sketchy. So
Yeah, very sketchy. It's a very unusual, almost like possibly criminal situation, right?
yeah. I just wanted to make sure that the assignment, like I had a good understanding of what to do for the assignment. So
No, I think you did well. Did you enjoy the class?
yeah, I mean, yeah, the class was I do want to go into like project management, so it was like a lot of it was very interesting, especially because sort of like the guest presentation on like agile and waterfall. I forgot his name, but he worked at Motorola. But
Yeah.
it was interesting to me because I'm also studying CS to get my master's in CS and also studying IE. So it's sort of like there was a good like overlap in both realms, I guess. So
Yeah. And there's some professors who teach agile in a pretty in-depth manner, right?
yes.
So, yeah, I mean, that's a whole methodology that I could have spent 10 weeks on. Instead, I spent probably 20 minutes on, maybe.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's just like anything else in project management. I gave you enough slices of different aspects that hopefully you got intrigued by something along the way.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. Bye-bye.
Bye.